So today we have the pleasure of being joined by Eva Guggemos. She is going to be sharing about the Black history of Forest Grove. Eva is an archivist and associate professor at Pacific University, where she has worked since 2011. Previously, she was a research services librarian at Yale University's Rare Book Library. She has a master's in history from Yale University, a Master of Library Science from Simmons University, and a bachelor's from the University of Kansas. She has written about the history of Forest Grove Indian School and other local topics. Eva is currently serving as the secretary of the board for the Friends of Historic Forest Grove. If you can please give a warm welcome to Eva Guggemos.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is the first time I've been to a Rotary meeting, so it's pretty interesting hearing everything you guys are up to. And I liked hearing those, I don't know what you called them, but the words of advice, the inspiration at the beginning. That was really great. So anyway, thank you for having me. And I prepared something. I have pictures and things to show you on slides. So I'm going to share my screen in just a second. And I just want to warn you up front that I may have gone a little bit overboard with how many slides I had. So I'm going to try to shorten it up a bit. So just one second. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Black history of Forest Grove, and thank you, Josh, very much for that little introduction you gave. Before I get started, I just want to give a really short disclaimer. You can probably tell from looking at me, well, maybe not, I don't know. I don't have African-American ancestry. I'm coming at this as an historian, so the sources I'm going to be using for this talk are all written sources. They don't necessarily tell the full story, and they certainly don't tell it from the same point of view as an African-American who actually lived through any of these experiences. And so I just want to put that out there up front, that I'm not attempting to speak for the African-American community or anything like that. I'm just trying to give my piece of the puzzle that I've been able to discover. Also, I wanted to give a little warning that there are a few slides in here that have offensive images. And so if you're concerned about that, you might want to take a rain check on watching the screen about halfway through. Okay, so like Josh said, I work at Pacific University as the archivist. And so I'm involved every year in doing some sort of display or event on Black History Month, which is February. And so we do have some things in Forest Grove's local history to celebrate related to Black history. Like, for example, one of Pacific's first African-American graduates was William Hilliard, who was the first Black editor of the Oregonian and also the first Black president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. But generally speaking, we often have to highlight, national Black history when we're celebrating at Pacific because, well, I know from other research I've done on Forest Grove that up until relatively recently, we literally were 98 to 99% white, if you look at the census. So it can be really hard to talk about local Black history, and I've never seen anything published anywhere about, Black history on a local level. So I thought this would be the year when I would try to delve into that. I started out in trying to do this research by just looking at census records. And so I pulled census data from 1860 to the present. Of course, we don't have the 2020 data yet, but for all the other censuses up through 2010, I pulled and looked at it on a county level just to see how many African Americans do we know lived here. And so if you look up, I don't know if you can see too well on your screen right now, it might be really small for you guys, but up through about 1940, the numbers of Black residents here in Washington County was extremely low. Just to pull that out, if you look at 1860 to 1940, the overall county population grew to just over 39,000. the Black population went from 0 to 7. So it was extremely low. Why that was? Well, it wasn't just, you know, happenstance or, you know, luck of the draw. It was related to a lot of things that were going on in the 1800s and early 1900s. And one of those things many of you have probably already heard about this, that Oregon had these exclusion laws earlier in our history, including some that were written into our state constitution that forbade Black people from coming to Oregon, staying in the state, owning property, completing contracts, all of those things. And so even though those laws were rarely enforced, you know, if you were a Black family, you probably wouldn't want to come to a state where you couldn't have a contract legally upheld, or, you know, that you could legally be kicked out of the state at any time. It was just not a good, like, certainly was not a welcoming environment. It took a lot to actually think about moving to a place like this. You know, if you can just imagine being the only Black person in a town that had a lot of discrimination in it, where you would be socially excluded, where you might even be harassed or maybe even subject to violence. It was not something that a lot of people were really willing to do. But surprisingly, despite what the census tells us, the census says 0 Black people lived here before about 1880. But surprisingly, there actually were a few people who dared to come out here and start farms really early on. And a lot of this knowledge is like new to me. I've only been finding out about it over the last few months. We recently found out about a family, James and Mary Beatty, who we think are the first people who were like openly living as African Americans nearby. They moved to a farm just south of Cornelius in 1873, which is really early. And they were quite interesting people. So James Beatty, both of them, by the way, just a little bit of background, they were both free Black people originally from Kentucky, and they moved to Oregon. They first moved to Portland before they moved to Cornelius. When they were in Portland, James actually headed up the celebration of the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which was the amendment that gave Black men the right to vote after the Civil War. So he was very much out there as being a member of the African American community. And Mary is even more interesting. She was one of the very earliest Black women to demand the vote west of the Mississippi. She went with Abigail Duniway. So I don't know if any of you recognize that name, but she was a very famous feminist. She went and did a challenge vote. She went with several other women and tried to vote in an election in 1872. This was really radical for a Black woman to do in the 1870s. So these were some of our earliest Black residents right near Forest Grove. Now, we had thought that those were the earliest in the area, but I published a little article about this in the Friends of Historic Forest Groves newspaper that came out about a week ago. And shortly after, I got an email from a member of our community who said, actually, I have an ancestor with African American ancestry who lived near Forest Grove and was like a member of the Masons and had all of these other community connections. And it turned out that there was this man named Jackson DeLetz who moved, he moved to Oregon in the 1850s. He had mixed ancestry, African, white, and Native. It turns out that when he got to Oregon, he seems to have never told anyone that he was partly Black. He told people that his parents were French. He was probably something like a quarter Black. So he had to hide his ancestry, and no one knew about it until people started doing genealogy later on. But he is now probably the first known African American person, or person with at least some African American ancestry, who lived in this area of the county. So it pushes back the date to 1870. And I just want to say, I think this is interesting because it just shows how much like the written record is not complete and how much we have to learn from people sharing their own family stories. So Cornelius has come up a couple times already as like a place where some people were living nearby. Forest Grove was a little bit later. Just on a political tip, Forest Grove was probably, at least this is my impression from having done a bunch of research into 19th century Oregon, Forest Grove seems to have been a little bit more tolerant, like slightly more tolerant, slightly more welcoming to people of other races compared to the average in Oregon, because of having this university right in the middle of town and having some pretty progressive churches. That doesn't mean that it was an easy place to live, though, if you were anything other than white. Like, better than average doesn't mean good. This is where we're going to see a couple of images that are a little bit, or more than a little bit, offensive. So I've looked through newspaper issues that were published in Forest Grove in like the late 1800s and early 1900s, looking for any mention of Black people. And what I noticed is that every mention of them kind of falls into two categories. One is that Black people were depicted as criminals and dangerous, like potentially violent. And the other was that they were like the butt of jokes. There would be a lot of jokes about Black people, depicting them as foolish, sort of buffoon type of characters. And so this was like what people around here, a lot of them probably didn't know any Black people personally. And so if they were absorbing these messages from media, that was kind of their picture of what Black people were like, which is kind of horrifying. And it wasn't just newspapers. It was also popular entertainment. And so if you look at this, this is a postcard of Yamhill from 1910. Just looks like kind of a standard scene. But if you cast your eyes over to the left, bottom left corner of this image, you can see there's actually a poster for a minstrel show back there in the background. So this was like a pretty popular and pervasive kind of entertainment that was here in Forest Grove in the 1910s. The place where the live theater that's in Forest Grove currently, the name is like slipping my mind temporarily, Theater in the Grove, that location had a lot of minstrel shows in the 1910s, and they were put on by Forest Grove High School, Pacific University, traveling shows that came through. They were really popular. And kind of shockingly to me, this interest in minstrel shows continued until up through the 1940s. And so this is a picture of a minstrel show that was done in Cornelius in the 1940s. And you can kind of see, if you aren't familiar with what these are, they were just very offensive, like kind of comical depictions of Black people, where white people would put on Black makeup and then do sort of funny songs and jokes. Totally beyond the pale nowadays, and pretty awful. But of course, that was not all, sadly. More disturbing than these shows and the media was like actual violence. So the Ku Klux Klan was very popular in the 1920s all across Oregon. It was especially popular in a few other counties like Tillamook, not quite so popular here in Washington County. But one of our local authors, whom some of you might know, Ken Bilderback, he just in the last 2 weeks turned up this article from the News Times in 1923 saying that a Ku Klux Klan meeting was being planned just west of Forest Grove, where they were expecting 2,000 Klansmen or several thousand Klansmen, and that they were going to have a fiery cross 70 feet high. It's kind of hard for me to imagine this going on so close to Forest Grove, but apparently it did. And I think more research is kind of needed into exactly what kind of influence the Klan had around here. So that was sort of the situation up through World War II. It was just not really a welcoming place to be. And that kind of, I think, explains why in 1940, there were only 7 African Americans recorded living in the entire county, according to the census. World War II starts to change things. More African Americans start to move into Oregon. A lot of them were going to work in wartime industry, and there was a little bit of spillover, just a little, into Washington County, with a few more families moving in. But there was also some like societal change, more interest in kind of pushing back against that like Jim Crow stuff that had been going on earlier. And it's around this time that Pacific starts to have its first African American students. The first one we know of was in the 1930s, a woman from Portland who was with us for 2 or 3 years but didn't graduate. Our first African American graduates were right around 1950. And there's that picture we see again of William Hilliard in Pacific's newsroom. And we had a few more, you know, kind of a small number, but continued to enroll African American students through the early 60s. But then in the late 60s, and so some of you, I don't know if any of you in the audience are longtime residents who were here in the 60s, but you may remember some of this history that I'm talking about now. Then in the late 60s, Pacific actually started to proactively recruit African Americans, and that was, I think, the main reason why actually is that there was a financial incentive. There was money under President Johnson to recruit students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so Pacific recruiters went down to places like LA and signed up African American students to come to Pacific. And we did this very consciously. Like, this is a picture from one of our view books in 1970. And it says, you know, the university has been a pioneer in seeking a broad social, economic, and ethnic representation. This is very much by design. And so we were really trying to do this to get a more diverse population as far back as like 1968 and 69. But for the students who came here at that date, it wasn't necessarily a positive experience. So I haven't done a lot of speaking personally with our alumni, but I've heard from other people in our alumni department who have. And for a lot of the students who came around this time, it was actually a really hard experience for them. There were around 70 African Americans at Pacific in like 1969, 1970, but there were virtually none in like all of the towns surrounding us. And they have said that like when they would step off campus, cars going by would yell slurs at them. Someone remembered like watermelons being thrown at them. It really didn't feel like a safe environment for them. And even on campus, they were included in campus life, but it just wasn't necessarily, it didn't feel like home for a lot of them. So they formed together this organization called the Black Student Union, which was sort of a club, but it also had kind of a political agenda to it. I mean, a lot of what they wanted to do was just host social events and have like parties and speakers and kind of a cultural home on campus. It wasn't necessarily super political, but of course, you know, we're talking about 1968, 1970. Everything was getting political on campus. And in fact, the very first event that the Black Student Union wanted to hold was inviting the comedian and activist Dick Gregory to speak on campus. And before he could come, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and this event had to be postponed by 6 months. And so things just sort of right away with the Black Student Union got off to this kind of, political start. And right after Dick Gregory, they invited a speaker from the Socialist Workers' Party, and people on campus, a lot of the white students and white staff just really didn't feel comfortable with this. There was a lot of talk on campus that the students just didn't, quote unquote, didn't fit in or weren't a good fit for Pacific. I think that's really sad, but that does seem to be kind of what a lot of people thought at the time. And by the late 70s, Pacific had sort of stopped really being proactive about recruiting African American students. So just for context, in 1970, Pacific said that we had the most African American students of any private college in the Pacific Northwest, which is a little bit sad that we only had to have 70 students for that to be the case. But still, Pacific was in a position to be sort of a leader in inviting African American students to live here in Forest Grove. And it really kind of melted away by the end of the 1970s. So going back to this sort of overall demographics for the county, well, just look, I don't know if you can see on the screen because the figures are small, but something happened in between 1970 and 1980, because all of a sudden the numbers for how many African Americans were living here went up by like sixfold during that decade. And then in each decade after that, it close to doubled again and again. So the number of African Americans in our county has been rising faster than the overall rise in our population. Of course, we don't have the 2020 census results yet, but the 2019 estimates that the government comes out with say that we probably have around 12,000 African Americans living in our county currently, about 2.4% of the population. I have to say, I think the percentage is a lot lower than that in Forest Grove, but at least the trend is going upward. And I just wanted to say too that I focused a lot on numbers in this talk, but of course those numbers are really not anywhere near as important as focusing on building a safe and respectful community for everyone, no matter, whether those numbers are really high or really low. That's really the bottom line, is that Forest Grove needs to be a safe and respectful place for everyone who lives here. And so I hope I didn't go too long. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I don't know if you guys normally have questions and comments and so on, but I'd be happy to hear any.
Yeah, that's the normal operating things. I noticed we did have a question in the chat just regarding Oregon's status when it entered the Union. Okay.
Yeah, I can answer that. So I'm not an expert in this, but I can answer this question. We were a free state, but we were it was a little bit weird. We came in as a free state, but a free state that did not allow Black people to live here. So you were not allowed, like if you were a slave owner, if you brought your slaves to Oregon, they had to leave Oregon within something like 40 days. So free, but for whites only.
And I'd like to make a comment, please. Jerry Fry here. I was a student at Pacific University, and I knew Paul and Paulette Owens, the twins, and what they went through. Paul and I were in the same fraternity, local fraternity there at the university. And his feeling of, here was a young man who was a tall, slender guy, 6'2", 6'3", and a big grin and a friendly guy. What he had to go through just to feel comfortable in certain situations was just, I couldn't understand. I don't know why. I took things too lightly, I suppose, to see the seriousness of how he felt. And I can remember in our fraternity house, where it had fairly narrow hallways, flattening himself against the wall so the other members could walk by, his fraternity brothers. So where he came from and how he felt this less than us, it still bothers me to think of that time when we were there together as fraternity brothers. I just want to share that little moment with you because I knew those young people, as myself at that time was a young person, and I couldn't really grasp how they felt less than I.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, that's what I've heard from just speaking to people in the alumni department, that a lot of our alumni from that period don't even necessarily want to talk about their time at Pacific, that it was not necessarily a positive experience, or that there were, just things they'd rather not dwell on.
Yeah, in that regard, yes.
Yeah.
Eva, I'd love to ask you a question. I'm Court Carrier. I'm a contract director for tourism for Forest Grove. And I have to tell you, that's a wonderful presentation about the history of Forest Grove and the Black community. We have such a rich history in Forest Grove, and it needs to be talked about, all of the different parts of our history. And I think that exploring that and getting to know a lot more about it is really critical. I loved your introduction with Bill Hilliard. I had the pleasure of working with his wife for many years. He was a meeting planner, and they were one of the first biracial couples, around the state, and incredible people. And I just think it's marvelous. So, when you're looking at the community and the population growth took place over such a long period of time in terms of growing, the 2020 census, it seems to me, probably has changed dramatically since 2010. And I was curious about that estimate of only 12,000 population in Washington County. And that surprised me. I would have thought that it would be a lot bigger since we have grown so much in population. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think at least part of it is that figure that I gave of 12,000 does not account for people who self-report as two or more races. And so there's an awful lot of people who may identify as African American, but also don't want to exclude like other parts of their heritage. And so that's probably a big part of it. I'm guessing there's a large slice of the population that has African American background, but aren't included in that 12,000. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know otherwise what it would all be about. I know that, so of course we have far more than 12,000 people of races other than white. It's just that our specifically African American population who self-report as only one race seems to have been fairly small still.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
I had a question, and it has to do with the Beatty's farm that you mentioned out there off a golf course. Do we know historically how the transaction of ownership of that property went from them to whoever? Because century farms are a big deal in this state, especially in this county. And if they were there in 1870, I would think that would be very historical. I think your presentation, by the way, was very good. I sent you a text, or I sent you a message in the chat, but I'm also curious if you've done any scholarly work on because it seems to me that there's more Latin influence here, Latinx influence in Washington County, in the history of those folks coming in, where they came from, and how they've established themselves. So have you worked on that group as well?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So I'm only sort of jumping in on the Beatty train relatively recently, like as far as, research that's been done on them. The person who's doing most of the research is named Jean Ward, and she has there's a Oregon Encyclopedia article on Mary Beatty that she wrote, and I think she's coming out with a book soon. So she's been doing a lot of research on sort of the property records. I know she's been in contact with people at the county to try to track down information about deeds and property. So she may already be looking into that. I'm kind of I don't want to step in on her research project too much. And so I'm going to let her, I know she's already working on it. So I'm going to let her kind of go down that path. I tried to look on Google Maps to see if there was still a farmhouse or anything there, and we couldn't really find anything. I suspect that a lot more information is going to come out about the Beattys over the next couple of years, they've only literally become known to us in the historical community within the last like 3 or 4 months. So it's all brand new. And then your other question about Latinx communities, this is something we're very interested in. There are people working on this. Washington County Museum, which is, recently renamed Five Oaks Museum, they did a whole bunch of oral history interviews with members of the community who moved here like very early, like in the 60s and 70s, who were connected with what is now Centro Cultural and some of the other associated, umbrella. And so there is a pretty good oral history record, but of course that still needs to be like interpreted and celebrated and all of those things. So I think it's going to be a work in progress. Thank you for both of the questions.
I have a comment more than anything. I agree with what Jerry said. I was at Pacific during the 70s, and we had a lot of Black Student Union demonstrations and programs going on. At the same time, we had a lot of Vietnam War protests going on. So it seemed like almost every time we turned around, there somebody was demonstrating something else all the time. And of course, being just a young guy back then, it was just overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Lots of conflict. You could literally go from one table to, I can't believe they're on campus, to the next table of, we need to show that we are people. We are real people. And it was just pretty much overwhelming to be on campus during the 70s.
Yeah, I can imagine. My mom, she didn't live around here, but she was at Berkeley between like 68 and early 70s. And so I've heard the same sort of thing. It must have just been both a very exciting time, but also, like you said, overwhelming.
Do we have any other questions? If you have a question for Eva, please just take yourself off mute and speak. All right. Thank you so much, Eva, for being here. What a great topic. And thank you, Josh, for bringing this to us. Give her a big hand, silent one.